that it didn't materialize, and there were serious concerns at both times about the sincerity of Chinese efforts. How sincere were they? There was always a level of deniability that they could walk it back, and they did in both cases walk it back. In 1960, they actually put more aggressive claim lines in Aksai Chin. In 1980, after Indira Gandhi's assassination, they walked back. In 1984 to 85, they walked back some of their earlier proposals. So it's going to be difficult. I give many of the reasons why it is such a difficult issue to solve. Ultimately, it will require political will, and we haven't seen that political will on the Chinese side to actually resolve this completely. Even when there has been a cooling in temperatures, as there has been in the last few decades, we've seen last year or so, we've seen other activity which suggests, for example, on the Brahmaputra, which suggests, the overall militarization and military posture of China has not fundamentally changed.
Hello and welcome to ABP Live. I have with me today Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar. He's a special guest. He's Executive Director of ORF America, basically handling the American Bureau for ORF. But he's now out with his new book, Vishwa Shastra. That's for our audience, Dhruva, India and the world. So welcome to ABP Live, and thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dhruva. I know, so you are joining us from the US. It is early morning there. So to quickly, we'll not take much of your time, but to just understand from the beginning of the fact that how this is a book that I found, and, when you also had the official launch, and I attended it in the sense that what I heard from you is, while there are many books that are there for India-Pakistan or India-China and other relationships that India has with key countries, there was not a single book that one can refer to when it comes to the holistic foreign policy picture that India has, let's say from history, from ancient times, till, let's say, the contemporary times, right? So what made you write this book? And you also said that you've traveled extensively across the length and breadth of this country.
Yes, so I think lots of things. I mean, one is it was sometimes answering questions that I had myself about India. And its role in the world. And I've worked over the years, I've worked almost 20 years now at think tanks, both in India and abroad, and worked on different issues, at various times, India, US, India, Europe, India, China, India, Pakistan. But I think two things. I think one is I felt a lot of people who approached me, both in India, sometimes they're younger people entering the field, sometimes it was diplomats who had, have taken the UPSC exam, have joined the IFS, sometimes it was foreign journalists who had come to India, and they wanted to know where to start. And in some ways, I think a lot of the context and background of India's earlier interactions with the world is what this book is meant to provide. So that's why I've tried to present that first part of the book is historical, it's chronological, starts in ancient times, goes to today. The other thing I didn't want to do, because a lot of it is integrated, I didn't want it to have separate chapters on India-China, India-Pakistan relations. I wanted to tell one story.
Right.
And so that I think that historical context and background, which is about 2/3 of the book, was one of the most important things I thought was useful. Again, I feel like even people who are seasoned diplomats or foreign policy analysts will know many parts of that story, but even not everyone will know all of it. And so that I think it would be useful to everybody in some way. The second part of the book is also the other big question I get is, what is India's strategy? And, does India have a strategy? And, you can't point to a single document that the Indian government produces that says this is what we are doing in the world. And so what I thought I would do is just answer that question in some ways, what I think, what I discern to be India's national strategy priorities, and how those fit together as well. So that's, I think, the second reason why I wrote it. I mean, even I remember just about 5 years ago, so The Economist had an article, and it basically says India doesn't have a strategy, doesn't know what it's doing, and so. And I feel like there's a method behind all of its actions, and so in some ways that's what I've tried to lay out.
Right. Well, what I really found after reading the book is the fact that you quite unflinchingly talk about the fact that how today in India, or maybe, from the very beginning, domestic policies, kind of the domestic policies that we have is shaping India's larger foreign policy. And you also suggest a kind of direction that India should take. Now, Just for the benefit of our viewers, and a lot of our viewers are, they're young readers and they would like to really pick up a copy of your book and understand that particular strategy that India has, in the sense that what really you wanted to say in terms of the fact that we do know that it's not just India, for other countries also, domestic politics is what shapes your foreign policy. But what is the direction you think that India can take, given that kind of a perspective that you have?
Yeah. So I think, two things came home to me. One is, if you look both historically and today, what is it that India's leaders, and I mean, just take prime ministers, for example, what is it that they wake up and worry about, and what are they concerned about, and what is top of mind? And what I found, you go back from 1947 on, they were concerned about how to leverage foreign relations to advance their domestic policy priorities.
Right.
And largely, this was economic development and security. I mean, to put it very simply, those were the two main priorities. There were other issues as well, but I would say 90% boil down to economic development and national security. And so one is, I felt it was very important because that's really what animates a lot of leaders in India. And that's natural. That's what animates political leaders in every country. The second thing is, if you look at India's joint statements, say with India and Italy, India and US, India and UAE, name almost any particularly advanced developing economy. A good chunk of that actually relates to India's domestic transformation. So what do the leaders talk about, and what do even Indian diplomats seek to get? They're looking for investment, they're looking for technology transfers, they're looking for defense deals. They're looking for the kinds of things that will help India's national security and economic transformation. So this takes up a very big chunk of the mind space and the energies of Indian diplomacy. And I felt that was not always reflected in, a lot of books look at the strategic picture, which is important, but that is much of the day-to-day work of what diplomats do today. So where I come out on this on the policy side is really focusing on those two priorities. One is economic transformation. How does India become a modern, industrialized country? And how can it essentially move towards greater technological self-sufficiency? Something India has been trying to do since 1947, in fact. In some ways, what I tried to get into also is why it hasn't happened, why it's sometimes been more difficult than we've anticipated. But really, it will require big, quite major outlays, financial outlays, better policy streamlining, with the intent of creating an industrial policy. And this is important for a number of reasons. One, I think in the post-pandemic world, and then after the India-China clashes, we've seen the Russian war on Ukraine. All of these have reinforced the notion that India ultimately, for some issues, will have to be self-sufficient in certain ways, or at least hedge against the possibilities of disruptions to the global economy, sometimes for reasons outside of India's own control. So I think we're in a very different phase from, say, the 1990s, where it was an era of free trade and liberalization. The world is flat. We need to lower trade barriers. Mm-hmm. Not that that is necessarily bad. It will have to be done in a much more calibrated way. So we're in an era today of competing industrial policies. Even the US is pursuing a sort of more industrial policy approach. And so that, I think, is one aspect of it. The second I focus quite a lot on is military preparedness. How can the Indian armed services collectively and the broader national security establishment prepare itself for things that no other country, the private sector cannot fill this role, civil society cannot fill this role. Ultimately, national security is the government's responsibility. And today, the pacing challenge primarily is China. And so how can India be prepared for that? So that's really what I focus on in terms of the domestic policy side.
I'll come to that military preparedness, portion also as well. And also the fact that, the larger debate that is going on right now, whether to have a national security doctrine. But coming to neighborhood first, and since you've dealt a large chunk in the book on the neighborhood, and I think that's going to be the single biggest challenge for India going forward. And also the fact that if you want to be this leader of global South and you want to be this global superpower, I think your first test is how you handle the neighborhood. So I'll read a line from your book, is that you're saying greater diplomatic attention, better functioning regional cooperation, increased economic and humanitarian assistance, and improved regional connectivity are a bare minimum for India if it seeks to retain a leadership role in the neighborhood. Now, if you can simplify that for us, because what we really feel, and us journalists writing about India giving aid to these countries all the time, and also a lot of lines of credit and other things. So what is it that you are saying is sort of missing in what we are doing, or what we have been doing for the past several years?
Yeah, so every country has certain kinds of difficulties with their neighbors.
Mm.
I think that's inevitable, particularly given the power disparity. India is a much larger country. And then there are other issues at play. I described them in some detail. We have ethnic overlaps. So the politics of Nepal or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka affects the politics in Bihar and Bengal and Assam and in Tamil Nadu. So these are some structural issues that India has to deal with, and has had to deal with for a long time. I think for many years there was a sense of neglecting the neighborhood, and then this was followed by a period, particularly in the 70s and 80s, of Indian intervention in the neighborhood. From starting in 1971 with the Bangladesh War, culminating with the IPKF in Sri Lanka in the late 1980s. But then there were also periods of neglect afterwards, and despite the best intentions of, say, Prime Minister Gujral, for example, and others who wanted to prioritize, there was a period, for example, of almost 10 years when no Indian Prime Minister visited Nepal. And I think if you take one of those, the preceding visit prior to 2015, 2014 was that was for a SAARC summit as well. So there wasn't even a bilateral visit to Nepal in over a decade. So, this is where I think some lost ground is now being made up. And what I outline is what some of those priorities are today. I don't think the end point will not be that there won't be political volatility in India's neighborhood. Ultimately, the politics of these countries will be decided by their own electorate, by their own population. We've seen quite a lot of change in Maldives and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Nepal. But what I think can be done, what I suggest is you can mitigate that volatility so that even if there are changes in government, you do have this codependency that leads to longer term cooperation. I think we've seen that to some extent with reasonably successful visits recently from the Maldives to India and from Sri Lanka. And despite the fact that in the Maldives case particularly, there was a campaign of a very strong India out campaign. Again, we have a government in Sri Lanka that historically that party has been very skeptical of relations with India. And yet, I think we've been able to forge some basic lines of cooperation. So this is a work in progress. It's not going to change overnight. I think there have been many positive strides in the past decade or so, but there's still a lot needs to be done to ensure a integrated neighborhood. And I would say one last thing on this, which is for many years, a lot of eggs were put in the SAARC basket. The SAARC would be the venue and the primary vehicle for regional integration. But essentially, because of Pakistan playing a difficult role in that and blocking a lot of initiatives, that really India was holding its regional policies hostage to Pakistan, which is unreasonable. So I think we've broken out of that now and finding new ways to integrate the region, and that is a positive.
Right. Points well taken, Dhruva, but also the fact that, I've visited all of these neighboring countries. I'm sure you also have. But, when you go there for sort of ground reportage, you get a lot of anti-India sentiments these days, which is a worry. And I know the government will be able to handle that effectively. But then the fact that they also say, since you talked about the SAARC point, I mean, be it Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, let us keep Pakistan away because we have a different dynamics with them. They all sort of want SAARC to get revived again, and they say that it is India on whom we are depending to revive that, because that's like the only vehicle we have to effectively face the world. So when India moves, we expect India moves, keeping us along. So what do you have to say to that?
No, the SAARC point is simple, which is India's been, at least for since the 1990s, been quite enthusiastic about supporting various SAARC initiatives. I don't think India has been slow on that. I think the challenge was there were various moments where Pakistan was, despite paying lip service publicly, was actually blocking various initiatives. So I don't think that the SAARC. So that's why today now India provides as much resources to BIMSTEC as it does to SAARC. Which is headquartered in Dhaka, which involves more countries, which has now a new mandate, a new charter. That's just one example of India looking at other ways of regional integration. But the other thing, obviously, there's going to be a degree of complaints, I've heard that too in various track two dialogues with Bangladeshi, Nepali, Sri Lankan counterparts. But I think, one is they also need to invest in a better understanding of India. I was talking to some students from South Asian countries, from some of the South Asian countries, and they, hardly any of them are studying India. It's interesting. They're studying China, they're studying the West, and
Right.
yet India is right there. So I think, it both, and I think a certain amount, obviously India needs to be sensitive to their concerns, and I obviously I advocate quite strongly for that we need to actually, more than not just in government but outside of government, we need to develop centers of learning about Sri Lanka, about Bangladesh, about
People
Nepal,
talk
starting.
about linkages, yeah.
Yeah. But they also, I think there is also a sense that you need to meet each other halfway. That at some stage they also need to be sensitive to certain Indian concerns as well. So I think a lot more work needs to be done. We're slowly going in that direction. I think the direction is correct. I think the pace could always be improved.
Right, right. So let me now, shift your focus to, of course, to China, the elephant in the room. And you say that, again, reading from your book, unless China adopts a fundamentally different approach to its role in international affairs, New Delhi will have to continue to prepare for a much more competitive relationship with Beijing. Now, we all know what has been happening between India and China for the past 10 years, so to say, because this is really the first time when we had two informal summits between both the leaders, and it seemed as if both will finally be addressing the border question. And what I believe is the fact that unless you settle the boundary question, there can never be normalcy coming in that. And the larger worry today is the fact that while China is settling the border issues with all its neighboring countries, tomorrow it can be Bhutan, you never know. But with India, this kind of competitive relationship will continue to happen. And also, do you really think that unless we address that core issue, we really cannot move forward, and these kind of skirmishes will continue? Maybe they'll continue for 2 years, 3 years, 7 years, but then this will continue. So what is your perspective, and what is it that you studied when you did this book?
So I can't predict what's going to happen in the future, but I do devote quite a lot of time in the historical section to the India-China border dispute, particularly the period between 1950 and 1962, and then periods after that, when in the 70s and 80s, where it either flared up again or there were negotiations between India and China. So actually, that I devote a lot of time to that. And one of the things I think that historical narrative exposes is, even when there were times when it looked positive. 1960, there was a moment. 1980, in the early 1980s, there was another moment where China seemed more open to discussing a settlement on the border.
Right.
That it didn't materialize, and there were serious concerns at both times about the sincerity of Chinese efforts.
Mhm.
How sincere were they? There was always a level of deniability that they could walk it back, and they did in both cases walk it back. In 1960, they actually put more aggressive claim lines in Aksai Chin. In 1980, after Indira Gandhi's assassination, they walked back. In 1984 to 85, they walked back some of their earlier proposals. So it's going to be difficult. I give many of the reasons why it is such a difficult issue to solve. Ultimately, it'll require political will, and we haven't seen that political will on the Chinese side to actually resolve this completely. Even when there has been a cooling in temperatures, as there has been in the last few decades, we've seen last year or so, we've seen other activity which suggests, for example, on the Brahmaputra, which suggests the overall militarization and military posture of China has not fundamentally changed. So all of this suggests that this is not a problem that's going away. I don't think it just has to do with China-India relations. I think this is largely about China and its own role in international affairs. And I think as long as you have the Chinese Communist Party and a leadership structure that prioritizes the interests of that party, you're going to see, and there's the sense of it being a growing power. They will try and use whatever leverage they have with other powers, like whether it's economic leverage, whether it's military leverage. And in India, they see a long-term competitor. Again, I think unless there is that very fundamental change, and that may happen, but until there are very clear signs of that, it is in India's best interest to plan for a more competitive relationship. And that means both on the military side, military preparedness, getting back to the earlier discussion, and also, I think, economic security as well. And we've seen a greater focus on that.
Mhm. Well, now really coming to military preparedness, and of course keeping China in mind, because that's the larger concern, not just for India, but we see for other countries as well. Now, this year, 2025, the government has said it will be the year of reforms when it comes to defense. And really, the core issue in this is creating theaterization and theater commands. Do you really think that when we talk about military preparedness, do we need really the theater commands creation, or do you think we really need to have a national security doctrine, so to say, that I hear from a lot of veteran diplomats and former national security advisors, the fact that instead of taking, because today is a world where you really have actual and real hot wars happening, right? So you cannot really say wars will not happen. They are happening, and the world is facing the impact of both wars. So do you think that it is important for India to have a national security doctrine, A, and B, along with that, you also need theater commands?
So the doctrine, I think a lot of people make, to be honest, some of the complaints, I can't speak for people in the government. I think there are pluses and minus sides to having a national security doctrine and a particularly publicly articulated one. The plus sides are that it gives, and presumably there would be a classified version, which is, not publicly available, and a declassified version that is publicly available. The plus side is I think it will lead to better communication and a better sense of priority, both internally and externally. People can, you can have junior military officers, junior diplomats pointing to this document to frame their own priorities and things like that. That I think is the advantage to it. The disadvantage, though, is particularly in the bureaucratic system, it can be too rigid sometimes. And there is a need sometimes to be more flexible. I think that has been the argument against it. You also need to create a level of consensus within the government, which is sometimes hard to, in practice, hard to achieve. So there's also a risk of politicization, which is any kind of publicly disclosed document will become, discussed in Parliament. It will become more politicized, and there are risks associated with that. So I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but I do think it's sometimes I find people in my business, which is in the analytical world, they say there's no national security doctrine, therefore there's no national security thinking. There's no, which is I think a bit of a lazy way to go about looking at it. And what I've tried to do, particularly in the second part of my book, is articulate what I discern to be a national security strategy for India. This is what I think is at least the outlines and the priorities of that. Now, on the military side, I think there'll be a few things to do. Most of these are well known and well understood within the defense ministry, within the national security structures. But I think the reforms have been in fits and starts really since Kargil, since the Kargil Review Committee outlined some of these. And they fall into a few baskets. I think one is the operational plans side, and today the fact is conflict will be integrated. Conflict between states particularly will be integrated. And that brings up the issue of jointness and theater commands. So that I think is one the reason I think sometimes there's the argument is jointness for its own sake, but the fact is in any real contingency involving China or Pakistan or another state, you will have to have the Army, Air Force, and Navy working much more seamlessly together than they currently are capable of doing, and that in turn will require us of theaterization. A second issue will be recruitment, and this has been also very politically sensitive. There's the Agnipath scheme that has been proposed by the government. There's been a lot of pushback to it, but something needs to be done on the recruitment and side, because I think the concern is that the pensions are just unsustainable in the long run, and that the bill associated with that, the outlay associated with that will be far too high. The third issue, and the big one, and I think the one that probably gets the most attention, is on the procurement side, which is, and actually there were just a few speeches given in the past few days, both by serving and former chiefs, and also serving and former defense secretaries, about who very much understand the need to change the recruitment pattern, the way procurement is done, and because currently it is very suboptimal. India's often unable to take advantage of economies of scale, unable to absorb technology. It's no longer a technological access problem. It is now a technological absorption problem. There are still issues between the public and private sector. So I think some big changes are going to be required in all of these areas. And then the final change, the area I would say is that has seen the most change for the better has been in the broader national security management space. And I think a strengthened National Security Council Secretariat that coordinates functions, sort of more seamlessness within the CCCS, National Security Council. That is something that we have seen some change on, but that's top down. The harder changes are the ones that I've mentioned are politically much more sensitive because of the DPSUs on the procurement side, because of the Agnipat, the controversies around Agnipat and on the recruitment side. So there are many interrelated problems. They will all need to be tackled. Sometimes a crisis is what instigates change, unfortunately. But hopefully, in the next few years, we can see some meaningful change in all of these areas that better prepares India's armed services to deal with the potential challenges of the future.
So Dhruva, let me also ask you a key point that I found very interesting at the official launch of your book when you said that India is best served when it prioritizes its interest over ideologies. Now, that the answer can be huge, but just to understand, do you feel that there is somewhere down the line ideologies are driving our interests? And if not, how do you see the way forward for that? Because in today's world, ideologies have become very sacrosanct, so to say. So how do you see that? What did you really mean? If you can break it down for our viewers in simplistic terms.
Yeah. I argue that India has been traditionally more interest driven than people give it credit for. And so it's largely been a realist. But where I think India has been poorly served when in the past it has prioritized the value ideology over interest. And I'll give a few examples of that to tell you what I mean. I think it was quite clear very early on that India needed a nuclear deterrent, particularly after China's test in 1964. And yet there was a lot of resistance in the 60s, 70s, 80s to India going nuclear. And this was it was not a practical, it was there were ideological reasons for it. Ultimately, India made the difficult decisions, and there were a handful of people who pushed those, including nuclear scientists, one of whom passed away recently, Chidambaram, but a few prime ministers, including Prime Minister Vajpayee, who ultimately made the decision to test. So in some ways, India was held back to some degree by ideology when it should have pursued that in a much more interest-driven manner, which would have served it better over time. And instead, India got the worst of all worlds on the nuclear side because it was denied nuclear access, it was outside the nuclear mainstream, and yet did not have a sufficient deterrent against China. And then Pakistan, which in the 80s overtook India in some ways in its development.
And there was American sanctions too. So I think.
Yeah, and India withheld the sanction. I mean, it was not the only reason. It wasn't just ideological. There were technological reasons as well that India was unable to do it. But the ideology certainly held India back at various points when it could have pursued it more. Essentially, after 1974, after the peaceful nuclear explosion, India held back on the weaponization until Pakistan actually caught up and surpassed India in its own nuclear weapons development. And then only India got its act together. So we lost a decade or so because largely for ideological reasons. I think another example is there was at times, I argue that at least as originally envisioned, non-alignment was a very practical approach that Prime Minister Nehru had a practical way of looking at the world, which grounded his view of non-alignment, at least initially. And that in some cases it served India quite well in the 1950s as well, particularly into the early 1960s. Then things came undone a little bit. And then you had periods of time in the 70s and 80s where India was, for all intents and purposes, not non-aligned. It was aligned with the Soviet Union. But that ideological grounding in non-alignment actually again prevented India from seizing upon certain opportunities with Pakistan, with China, with the US, even with the Soviet Union, that it otherwise would have pursued had it not been so ideological. Had certain leaders at certain times not been so grounded in ideology. And a third example I would give is on Pakistan, which is, I think, sometimes in the face of a reality where Pakistan was not deviating from pursuing a policy of using terrorism as a tool against India. They were, and there remains a strong ideological bent for, well, we need this sort of Aman ki Asha. We need a sort of normal relations with Pakistan. Now, normal relations with Pakistan would be a good thing, but ignoring the reality of what Pakistan is doing is where, sometimes again that in the longer run particularly hurts Indian interests as well. So I think these are some examples of where I think decisions were made in the past that prioritized ideology over interests, which may have served certain functions at certain times. They may have served political functions at certain times, but in the long run, eventually came back to bite India.
Mhm. But just to pick up on the point that you talked about Pakistan, now there is this larger debate that's been going on whether to talk with them or not. But you know what the government says, that talks and terror cannot go together. Uh, do you think that's a good stance, or that is what should be our interest? What do you think?
No, so I mean, I've gone into the talks question a little bit, both in terms of what happened over the past 20 years, particularly after the Lahore Declaration, um, and why, at anytime a Pakistani leader essentially was serious about talks, it was undermined by a major incident, either the Mumbai terrorist attacks in 2611 terrorist attacks in 2008, the Pathankot terrorist attacks immediately after Prime Minister Modi goes to Lahore. So at every instance where there has been appears to be a sincere effort on the part of some Pakistani leaders to engage with India, it has been undermined by an incident like that. But I give some reasons for why India still continues to have dialogue, and every prime minister has attempted dialogue with Pakistan. And the reasons are essentially to prevent third-party mediation, which Pakistan wants. India believes these issues need to be resolved bilaterally because it has the advantage, whereas Pakistan believes that third-party mediation will play in its favor and historically has been proved right by that, whether it was the UN in the 1940s, whether it was on the run of Kutch in the 1960s, where again it was third-party mediation that helped Pakistan effectively. There are reasons that India does engage in dialogue with Pakistan. It also wants to keep lines open to multiple actors because you do have multiple actors in Pakistan. You have multiple political actors, social movements. You have minority groups there. You have the army and security apparatus. So India does need to keep lines open to multiple actors in Pakistan. So there are realistic reasons, but the idea of talks for the sake of talks again seems to me to be prioritizing ideology of interest. What is the purpose of talks if they're not to achieve something that India desires in its own interest?
Sure. And just a little point in that, and since you are, an expert on America, how do you see these dynamics changing once President Trump comes in? And that's the larger worry that, not just India, but all countries have.
I think there's some things obviously that Trump will prioritize or not. He honestly doesn't care about India, Pakistan. I mean, he's talked when Imran Khan visited when he was earlier president. He very publicly said something about resolving Kashmir, but India has basically pushed that away. But on major issues, I think when there were incidents on the border during his presidency, he largely backed India or didn't care and said India should deal with this problem. I mean, that's on the Pakistan question, but I mean, I think largely we'll see a much more transactional US, less interest in multilateral institutions. In some ways, that gives India more space. In some ways, though, India is more on its own in certain venues, in certain forums. You'll see more transactionalism on trade and immigration. I think that will be the immediate issue that will come up after Trump's inauguration in about 2 weeks' time. So I think we should be prepared for that world. But in some ways, we were sliding towards that world anyway. We have hints of it even under Obama, of America becoming much more transactional. And again, India, I think, is better prepared. At least the India as I describe it in a sort of interest-driven India is better prepared to deal with it, that world, than frankly many parts of Europe are, or Japan is. And these are countries that for their security and for their trade are much more dependent, or Canada. These are countries that are much more dependent on the US and will have much more trouble adjusting to a more transactional US. I was in Germany, a month or two ago, and there was a much greater panic there than I sense in Delhi.
Mhm. And my very last question to you, Dhruva, I'm sure you've been asked this a million times, but for the benefit of our viewers, and just quickly, if I can ask you, how much influence your father had on the book, or your grandfather's rich legacy? He's we read his books all the time, so how much of that influenced your decision making? I'm sure when you were young, you must have heard all those stories from him. So.
Yeah, so I think my father less so. Partly, I think we're very different. He's a practitioner. He's a diplomat. He's worked as a diplomat for almost 50 years. His job is to do international relations. I've been for 20 years an analyst. So in some ways, I have much easier job. I can sit and analyze. I have space to think. I have space to write, research, go into things. So I think in some ways not so much. And again, he's written two books recently. His books are more they're not heavily researched books. They're his ideas on how India should behave with the world. What I've tried to do is, particularly the first part of the book, the first two-thirds of the book, I've tried to describe. So it's not my views so much as what I observe India has done in the past. The last third of the book gets a bit more into what I think India should do. So I think they're very different in that sense. I think that is more for what does the current external affairs minister think about the world, and how does situate India in the global landscape. Mine, I think, is much more. My book is meant to be much more descriptive and for an introductory audience. And actually, I had a few conversations with young people, including young diplomats, young students, who they read my father's book and they said, it was very interesting, but I didn't understand all of it. So I think hopefully, what I've tried to do is write more for that level. I think my grandfather, I think, in some ways had a bigger influence. He didn't put together a single book like this. His books were more sometimes collections of essays on topics that he wrote about. He wrote when he was at IDSA, the Defense Ministry think tank. He wrote a lot of reports on a number of issues, across almost every aspect of national security. He was involved in committees, including the Kargil Review Committee, the nuclear, the committee that drafted the initial nuclear doctrine. But I think he did not put together something that was comprehensive. He didn't really intend to do that, and I think in some ways I was more heavily informed by conversations with him. I had the privilege of working with him quite closely for a few years, so I think in some ways his outlook, in some ways maybe his realist worldview, informed me much more
Right.
than I think what my father's career has.
Mhm. Well, great. Thank you so much, Dhruva, for speaking to us. And again, for our viewers, this is Vishwa Shastra, the India and the world. So I'm sure people will get a lot of information, and many information that are there, but all scattered, can be found in one book. Thank you so much for giving us your time, Dhruva, and all the best for the book once again.
Thank you, Naima.